The morning felt calm, almost serene as I set out along the narrow trail, excited for the solitude I craved. This particular path was tucked away from the popular routes, a gem I had stumbled across in an online forum for hiking enthusiasts. Most people warned about how easy it was to lose cell service and that the dense forest could quickly turn disorienting, but that only drew me in more. I wanted the escape, and the idea of exploring an untouched part of nature made the early morning wake-up worthwhile. The trailhead was deserted when I arrived, which wasn't unusual given the remoteness, but as I walked, a strange feeling crept in. The silence was too thick. I could hear the crunch of every step, the rustling of my clothes, even the faint breath from my own lungs. There were no birds, no insects, no distant hum of life, just the dull thud of my boots against the earth. The stillness amplified each sound I made, and before long I began noticing things along the trail. The first symbol, carved roughly into the bark of a tree, seemed like a crude attempt at art, until I saw another one, this time on a rock. The symbols weren't easy to decipher. They looked almost primitive, as if someone had gouged them hastily with something sharp. As I continued, they grew more frequent, some faded and others freshly etched. They were symbols I didn't recognize, strange and angular, unsettling against the organic shapes of the forest. I tried brushing it off as someone's odd pastime, but a sense of wrongness began settling in, a feeling that only grew as I ventured further in. After an hour of walking, the feeling of isolation morphed into something darker, a sense that I wasn't quite as alone as I'd thought. I brushed it off initially, blaming my nerves or maybe the strange carvings I kept seeing. But as I moved forward, the sound began, soft, like a whisper of steps matching my pace but delayed by a beat. I stopped abruptly, listening, and the sound stopped too. I looked around, expecting to catch a glimpse of someone or something, but the forest stared back in silence. When I started moving again, the sound resumed, just on the edge of my hearing, like a faint echo of my own footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but each time I stopped to listen, it stopped with me. The idea of turning back crossed my mind, but pride, or maybe foolish curiosity, kept me moving forward. It was a subtle, insistent feeling, as if something beyond my understanding was drawing me further in. The symbols continued to appear, almost leading me along, guiding my path with their haunting presence. Each time I glanced at one, a prickle of discomfort spread through me. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker, and the weight of eyes on me was impossible to shake. It was sometime after noon when I first saw it. I'd been scanning the trees, half expecting some sort of wild animal, anything to explain the eerie sounds and the symbols. And then, just off the trail to my left, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow, slipping between the trees, gone almost before I registered it. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart thudding as I squinted into the distance, hoping to catch another glimpse. But the forest remained still. I resumed walking, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, my eyes playing games in the dim forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few minutes later, I saw it again, this time closer. The figure was dark, almost indistinct, a blot of shadow that moved with unnerving silence. I stopped to stare, to make sense of it, but the figure slipped behind a tree, vanishing as if it had never been there. It felt like it was toying with me, testing my limits, watching to see how much fear I could endure. The thought of retreating flitted across my mind, but something told me that if I turned back now, I'd only be inviting the shadow to follow me. That turning my back on it would be a grave mistake. As I continued, the symbols became more frequent, a pattern that seemed anything but random. They lined the trail like ominous markers, leading me deeper into the wilderness. Each one I passed felt like a warning, but of what, I couldn't tell. I glanced over my shoulder often, feeling a weight of eyes on me, yet the figure was nowhere to be seen. My pace quickened, each step more urgent than the last. I tried varying my speed, pausing suddenly, even veering slightly off the trail in hopes of breaking the strange rhythm between us. But it was pointless. The sense of surveillance persisted, clinging to me with an unnatural intensity. It was as if something had claimed the forest and allowed me only limited freedom within it. I felt like a pawn in some twisted game, lured forward by the symbols, tracked by the silent presence I couldn't escape. A realization crept in then. This presence, whatever it was not here by accident. I felt as though I had crossed a line, stepped into a domain I had no business entering. Yet every step seemed to drag me further in, further away from any semblance of safety. The tension had reached a breaking point. I was no longer cautiously curious or nervously intrigued. I was afraid, and that fear had morphed into a desperate need to escape. The symbols were everywhere now, carved into nearly every tree and stone along the path, as if mocking my vulnerability. I couldn't look away from them. Each one felt like a warning I hadn't heeded, an invitation I shouldn't have accepted. Then I saw it, the figure, closer than ever before. It wasn't just a shadow this time. It was something tangible, lurking just within my field of vision. My heart raced as I realized it was moving, not just observing, but slowly advancing. The faint rustling of leaves matched the rhythm of my own panicked breaths, each sound amplifying the terror clawing at my mind. I couldn't turn my back on it. Every instinct told me that running blindly would only make things worse, but the presence was closing in. The path felt claustrophobic, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels, trapping me in their labyrinth. I quickened my pace, nearly running now, hoping I could outdistance whatever it was. But no matter how fast I went, the feeling of being watched, of being pursued, stayed with me. It was as if I was locked in a game I didn't understand, with rules that changed at every turn. I felt my sense of direction slipping, the trail's once familiar markers now distorted and confusing. I was lost, trapped in the maze of symbols and shadows. My desperation led me off the trail. I veered into the underbrush, pushing through tangled branches and prickly bushes, hoping that leaving the path would shake off whatever was following me. But as soon as I left the trail, the forest seemed to close in even more. The shadows deepened and the silence became oppressive, suffocating. Every step felt wrong, as if I were intruding on something sacred, some hidden place not meant for human feet. I could feel it again. The figure, or whatever it was closer now, so close that I could sense its presence in the air around me. The space between us shrank, and I realized I was cornered, with nowhere left to turn. I stood frozen, every muscle tensed, waiting for the figure to make a move. The symbols loomed around me, carved into the trees as if marking my final position, my inevitable capture. I felt the weight of dread settle heavily in my chest. In that moment, I truly believed I wouldn't make it out. Then a flicker of movement from the figure, closer than ever. I was paralyzed, caught between the urge to flee and the fear of provoking whatever hunted me. I felt helpless, rooted in place as the presence advanced. Out of nowhere, I found the strength to break free from my paralysis. With a final surge of desperation, I sprinted through the trees, not caring where I went as long as it was away from that figure. The symbols vanished from my sight, replaced by an endless sea of trees and shadow. The trail was no longer visible, and I was lost, but I didn't care. I just needed to escape the presence that seemed to linger just behind me, silent and unyielding. As I ran, the footsteps behind me grew louder, the sound matching my own frantic pace. I knew, without a doubt, that I was being chased, hunted through this maze of trees and underbrush. I felt the branches clawing at my arms and legs, leaves scratching my face. But I didn't stop. I could feel the figure closing in, each step bringing it closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear pushed me forward. I wasn't running toward safety anymore. I was running away from something I couldn't see, but could feel. Every step pulsing with the need to escape. Then, just as I felt I couldn't go any further, I saw a break in the trees. The trailhead, the end of this nightmare, was in sight. I pushed myself harder, the final steps dragging me out of the darkness and back into the safety of daylight. The moment I arrived, I felt the weight lift. It had been a grueling few months, and this isolated Airbnb was exactly what I needed. A chance to reset, to disconnect from everything, and find some peace. The property was nestled between thick trees, with only a dirt road leading up to it, which made it feel private and untouched. The small house was cozy, with a warm rustic charm that made me feel at home instantly. I unpacked, grateful for the solitude, and settled in, savoring the silence that surrounded me. By evening, I was beginning to unwind. The soft creak of the house, the gentle rustle of leaves outside, all of it felt comforting. I was about to settle down with a book when I heard a knock at the door. It was unexpected, and in a place as remote as this, unusual. I opened the door to find a man standing there, looking mildly annoyed. He introduced himself and said he'd booked the same place, insisting that this was his reserved room. Confused, I told him that I'd booked the Airbnb for myself, showing him the confirmation on my phone. He looked at the screen briefly, nodded, and without much resistance, left. I closed the door, feeling a little unsettled, but relieved that he'd taken my explanation. I brushed it off, assuming it was a simple mix-up, and tried to return to my book, though the knock on the door replayed in my mind as the evening drew on. The next day, I tried to shake off the strange encounter. I told myself it was just an error, nothing more. I spent the morning hiking along the nearby trails, enjoying the untouched nature and the peace of isolation. By the afternoon, I was beginning to feel more settled, forgetting about the man's odd appearance the night before. But just as I was starting to relax, there was another knock. I opened the door to see him again, the same man, only this time his expression was more intense, almost frustrated. He insisted that he was supposed to be there, claiming there had been a mix-up and that I was the one in the wrong. His persistence was unsettling, and I felt my calm erode with each word he said. I told him, firmly but politely, that I had the reservation and that he needed to leave. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he stepped back, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't make out. He left, but the tension lingered long after he disappeared from view. The thought that he might return nagged at me, and though I told myself it was unlikely, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished. After that second encounter, my sense of peace was shattered. The isolation that had felt so inviting now felt oppressive, like it was hiding something sinister just beyond the tree line. Every small sound outside, the wind rustling through leaves, branches creaking in the breeze, became amplified, sending my senses into overdrive. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and spent the rest of the day with an uneasy awareness that someone, somewhere, might be watching me. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard footsteps outside. They weren't hurried, they were slow, deliberate, pacing around the house. My heart pounded as I lay in bed, straining to listen, wondering if it was him. The footsteps continued, making a slow circuit around the property. I imagined him standing just outside, his eyes on the walls, his ear pressed to the door, waiting for me to come out. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, and I could barely sleep, every small noise feeding my growing fear. The following morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I tried to convince myself that the footsteps were just my imagination, a trick of the mind in an unfamiliar place. But as I went about my day, the fear lingered. In the early afternoon, there was a loud, insistent knock on the door. I hesitated, heart racing, but forced myself to open it. It was him again, and this time he looked angry. He demanded to be let in, his voice hard and his stance rigid, as though he was daring me to refuse. The way he looked at me was unnerving, his eyes narrowed, his face set in an expression that bordered on hostility. I told him firmly that he needed to leave, my voice shaking as I tried to sound confident. He stayed there, staring, his jaw clenched, before he finally turned and walked away without another word. As he disappeared into the trees, I felt a sense of dread settle over me. The feeling of isolation had turned from peaceful to terrifying, and I was acutely aware of how alone I was, with no help nearby. I couldn't shake the feeling that this man was dangerous, and that if he returned again, it wouldn't be a simple knock at the door. I resolved then and there to cut my trip short and leave as soon as possible. I started packing that afternoon, feeling a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore. My hands shook as I folded my clothes and stuffed them into my bag, each small noise outside heightening my fear. I tried to reassure myself that I'd be out of here soon, that this would all be behind me. But as I moved around the Airbnb, I started noticing subtle, unsettling signs that made me doubt my safety even more. The first thing I noticed was my backpack. I'd left it near the door the night before, but now it was slightly ajar, as if someone had rifled through it. Then I noticed my phone charger coiled neatly on the table when I was sure I had left it plugged in. I checked my suitcase and found that some of my clothes had been shifted, folded differently than I'd left them. My pulse quickened as I realized these weren't mistakes on my part. Someone had been inside the Airbnb. A chill ran through me as I spotted something on the bedside table. A note scrawled on a piece of scrap paper. It was brief, only a few words, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through me. The note simply read, "I'll be back." It was in sloppy handwriting, with a smudge of dirt on the corner, like it had been written hastily. My breath came fast as I stared at it, my mind racing with the knowledge that the man had invaded my space, watched me as I slept, touched my belongings. The need to leave grew more urgent, and I felt trapped in the Airbnb, with every passing second making my skin crawl. I tried to sleep that night, but rest was impossible. I lay there, tense and alert, my eyes glued to the door, listening for any sign of the man's return. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I kept the lights off, hoping the darkness would hide me, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. The isolation that had once felt inviting now seemed like a curse, a reminder that no one would hear me scream if things went wrong. Sometime around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling the house. They paused occasionally, lingering by the door, by the windows, as if the man were deciding his next move. I lay there, barely breathing, frozen in fear, willing the sounds to stop. But they continued, a haunting reminder of the threat that waited just outside. I considered calling for help, but there was no service, and the nearest town was miles away. I was alone, truly alone, with a stranger whose intentions were anything but friendly. I gripped my phone, staring at the blank screen, as the footsteps circled closer. I began to doubt if I'd make it through the night, the fear pressing down on me like a physical weight. I couldn't bear the thought of waiting until morning, but I also couldn't bring myself to open the door and risk a confrontation. I was trapped, a captive to my own fear, as the man's presence lingered just outside. At the first hint of dawn, I couldn't wait any longer. I packed my things hastily, throwing everything into my bag with little care. My only thought was to get out, to leave the Airbnb and put as much distance as possible between me and that man. I barely glanced around the room as I stepped out, my heart pounding as I made my way to my car, praying that he wouldn't show up. But as I reached the edge of the property, I saw him standing there, just beyond the tree line. He didn't move, didn't say a word, but his gaze was fixed on me, his eyes cold and calculating. It was as though he was daring me to leave, watching with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I thought he would approach, that he would make one last attempt to stop me, but he remained silent, unmoving, like a shadow waiting to follow me. I felt a shiver of fear as I climbed into my car, his gaze still on me, unblinking. As I pulled away, I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me, a silent threat that promised he wasn't finished. The road ahead was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, that he'd follow me if I slowed down or stopped. I'd always wanted a place like this, a quiet house, tucked away in a peaceful neighborhood, with just enough charm and seclusion to feel like my own little world. Moving in felt like the beginning of something new, a chance to leave behind the noise and stress of the city. As I unpacked, I took in the old yet sturdy walls, the wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and the large windows that let in the soft afternoon light. The house had character, a certain charm that drew me in from the moment I'd first seen it. That first night, I settled in easily, enjoying the silence and solitude. But as I lay in bed, just as sleep was beginning to take hold, I heard it. A faint noise, like a soft thump coming from beneath the floorboards. My eyes opened and I listened closely, trying to make sense of the sound. It was subtle, almost like a gentle knock, but coming from somewhere below. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the house settling, the groans and creaks of an old structure adapting to new life. Yet even as I fell asleep, the faint noises lingered in my mind, a small, unexplainable curiosity. Over the next few days, I heard the noises again. They were subtle at first, a faint scraping, an occasional rustle, as if something were shifting beneath the floor. But as the nights went on, the sounds became more distinct. I could almost make out footsteps, shuffling quietly, moving slowly from one end of the house to the other. My curiosity grew, but so did my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that these noises weren't just random creaks. Each night I'd strain to listen, trying to determine where the sounds were coming from. But the house had no basement, no crawl space below, just solid ground. It didn't make sense. I brushed it off, telling myself it was my imagination. But the persistent sounds seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to ignore. Finally, one evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to understand what was going on, to find some logical explanation. Hoping to find some answers, I decided to explore the neighborhood, thinking that perhaps someone nearby might know something about the history of the house or the land it was built on. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly older homes like mine, surrounded by trees and narrow, winding streets. I walked for a while, taking in the surroundings, each step deepening my curiosity about the place I'd moved to. I saw a few people out in their yards, but something about them seemed distant, as though they were used to keeping to themselves. As I walked further from the house, I noticed a narrow path veering off from the main street, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and vines. It didn't look like it was used often, but something about it drew me in. I pushed through the foliage, following the path to its end, where I stumbled upon a strange sight, a hidden tunnel entrance, half concealed by tangled branches and leaves. The tunnel looked old, carved out of stone and soil, its entrance dark and foreboding. A wave of apprehension washed over me, but the mystery was too intriguing to ignore. The strange noises, the sense of something hidden just out of reach, it all felt connected somehow. I took a deep breath, my curiosity pushing aside my fear, and stepped into the tunnel, the darkness closing in around me. I turned on my flashlight, the beam piercing the thick darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tunnel was narrow, the air stale and cold, carrying an unpleasant, damp odor that made me want to turn back. But the strange discoveries around me kept me moving forward. Scattered along the ground were remnants of clothing, worn jackets, tattered shirts, even a pair of shoes, as though someone had abandoned them in a hurry. Further in, I found discarded food containers, some still half full, though spoiled beyond recognition. There were scraps of paper, a crumpled water bottle, and other remnants of someone's brief, chaotic presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing in someone else's space, that these remnants had been left behind by people hiding in the shadows, just out of reach. As I moved deeper, I became aware of a strange tension in the air, an almost palpable sense that I was not alone. The silence around me felt heavy, pressing down, amplifying every small sound I made. I crouched down to inspect one of the clothing piles, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when suddenly a sharp pain shot through my leg. Startled, I looked down to see a small rock rolling away, as if it had been thrown at me. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight darting over the walls, but I saw no one. Then, from somewhere deep in the tunnel, I heard it, the faint echo of distant screams and the sound of hurried footsteps approaching, growing louder with each passing second. Panic seized me, and I realized in that instant that I needed to get out. The echoes of the footsteps grew louder, reverberating off the narrow tunnel walls, filling the space with a frantic, menacing energy. My heart raced as I stumbled back, the flashlight beam shaking wildly as I tried to steady myself. The distant screams mingled with the footsteps, creating a chaotic, nightmarish sound that filled me with a sense of pure terror. I couldn't see anyone in the darkness, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was coming. I turned and began to run, the walls of the tunnel closing in around me as I sprinted toward the entrance. I could hear rocks scattering underfoot, each step amplifying the fear that I wouldn't reach the exit in time. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out all other sounds, as I focused solely on the narrow patch of light ahead. But just as I neared the entrance, another stone struck my shoulder, harder this time, jolting me forward. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, but managed to catch myself, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the ground. I scrambled to pick it up, not daring to look back, the urgent footsteps closing in, closer now, as though whoever was behind me could almost reach out and grab me. With a final burst of energy, I dashed out of the tunnel, my lungs burning as I finally burst into the open air. I ran through the overgrown path, branches and thorns clawing at my clothes and skin, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that tunnel as possible. The sound of footsteps faded as I put distance between myself and the tunnel, but the fear remained, gripping me with an intensity that I couldn't shake. I glanced back just once, half expecting to see someone emerging from the darkness, but the entrance was empty, eerily silent, as though nothing had happened. The night was still, and the quiet of the neighborhood felt oppressive, pressing down on me as I hurried back to my house. Every step felt heavier, my body weighed down by a lingering sense of dread. When I finally reached my front door, I locked it behind me, leaning against it as I caught my breath, my mind racing. The strange clothes, the spoiled food, the screams and footsteps, all of it swirled in my mind, a disturbing puzzle that I couldn't piece together. All I knew was that something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, and that whatever was down there in the darkness was more than I could handle. Despite the safety of the locked door, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt different, its silence charged with a sense of menace, the walls seeming to close in around me. I moved through each room, double-checking every window and lock, but it did little to ease my mind. The memory of the footsteps, the screams, echoed in my thoughts, relentless and haunting. That night, as I tried to sleep, the noises beneath the floorboards returned, louder than before, as though something or someone had followed me back. The sounds were distinct now, unmistakable. I could hear the faint thumping, the scratching, the shifting weight of someone moving directly below. I lay frozen, my heart pounding, listening to the sounds traveling beneath me, realizing that whatever was down there was not just an echo, it was real, and it was close. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sounds again, felt the creeping dread of those unseen footsteps coming closer. The house felt tainted, filled with a darkness that had seeped in from that hidden tunnel. I knew, deep down, that staying here wasn't an option. This wasn't just a place to live, it was a place that held secrets, secrets that I didn't want to uncover. By morning, I'd made my decision. I couldn't stay here, couldn't live with the oppressive fear that now permeated every room. Hastily, I packed my belongings, grabbing only the essentials, unwilling to spend a moment longer in a place that had once felt like a dream, but now felt like a nightmare. The office was familiar territory, a comfortable, professional environment where everyone respected each other's boundaries. I'd been working here for a while and had developed friendly, cordial relationships with most of my colleagues. So when we got a new hire, I didn't think twice about introducing myself and extending a friendly welcome. The new coworker, Alex, was outgoing and engaging, asking about my background and sharing bits about theirs. At first, I appreciated their interest. It's nice when someone new takes an active interest in their team. I assumed Alex was just trying to get to know the people they'd be working with. They were friendly and pleasant, if a bit more curious than most. But nothing seemed unusual, and I took it as a friendly gesture. As the weeks went on, however, Alex's questions became more frequent and personal. They'd ask about my hobbies, the places I like to go after work, my weekend plans. I brushed it off as friendliness, reminding myself that some people are simply more inquisitive than others. Still, I couldn't shake a small feeling of unease, as though Alex's interest went beyond a simple work connection. It started with a message outside of work hours. It was a Thursday evening, and I'd just settled in at home when my phone buzzed with a notification from Alex. I opened it, expecting something work-related, but was surprised to see a personal message instead. Alex had written, "Hope you're having a relaxing night. It must be nice to get a break from the office." The message felt odd, a little too personal for a coworker I barely knew. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I didn't want to seem rude. I replied with a simple, "Thanks, you too," keeping it brief, hoping that would end the conversation. Alex replied immediately, though, with a cryptic, "I'm sure I'll see you around sooner than you think." The comment left me puzzled. I dismissed it as harmless, telling myself that Alex was just being friendly, maybe even a bit quirky. But a faint discomfort lingered, the beginning of a feeling that I couldn't quite explain. The following weekend, I went to my favorite coffee shop to unwind. It was a quiet spot I'd been going to for years, a place I rarely ran into anyone from work. But as I ordered my coffee and found a seat, I was startled to see Alex walk in. They spotted me almost immediately, flashing a big smile and heading over to join me. "Hey! Fancy seeing you here," Alex said, sitting down across from me without waiting for an invitation. I managed a polite smile, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But Alex's presence felt invasive, as though they had deliberately sought me out. Over the next few days, this pattern continued. Alex began running into me at places I frequented, stores, the gym, even the park where I like to take walks. Each time they'd greet me with an overly familiar smile, as though we were old friends. I tried to convince myself that it was just coincidence, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing unease. I started to wonder if Alex was somehow tracking me, if each encounter was as accidental as they claimed. The messages escalated. Now, Alex would reach out multiple times a week, often in the evenings or weekends, commenting on things that seemed strangely personal. "Saw you at the park today. Looked like you were deep in thought," one message read. Another said, "Nice choice on that book. I'd love to know what you think of it." The messages made my skin prickle. It was clear that Alex was observing me closely, noticing details about my daily life that I hadn't shared. The idea that they were watching me, even outside of work, left me feeling exposed, as though my personal life was no longer my own. I began changing my routines, going to different places, taking different routes, trying to avoid any more accidental encounters. But Alex seemed to know my patterns, each message a reminder that they were always nearby, always watching. My discomfort grew into something more serious, an anxious dread that followed me even at work. I found myself avoiding them, keeping my interactions brief, hoping they'd take the hint. But each message, each overly familiar coincidence, only reinforced my growing fear that this was no friendly interest. It was something more, something I couldn't ignore any longer. After a weekend of constant intrusive messages and uncomfortable encounters, I knew I couldn't let this go on. The anxiety that had started as a faint discomfort had transformed into a constant, unsettling weight, something I could no longer brush aside. I felt watched, scrutinized, as though every move I made was cataloged. I knew it was time to set boundaries. On Monday, I decided to confront Alex, planning my words carefully. I wanted to be clear, but I didn't want to escalate the situation further. During a moment when we were alone, I calmly told them that I needed some personal space. I explained that I valued a strictly professional relationship, and that the extra attention and messages were making me uncomfortable. I asked that our interactions remain work-related, hoping they'd understand. At first, Alex appeared surprised, their face falling as though I'd insulted them. But then, something shifted. The polite expression disappeared, replaced by an icy, angry look. They muttered something under their breath, a vague, veiled threat that was barely audible but unmistakable. Before I could respond, Alex turned and walked away, ending the conversation abruptly. I stood there, shaken, the encounter replaying in my mind. The anger in their eyes had startled me, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. I had hoped that setting boundaries would put an end to the discomfort, but Alex's reaction left me more unsettled than ever. The next day, Alex's behavior changed drastically. They avoided me completely, going out of their way to ignore me, acting as though I didn't exist. There were no more messages, no accidental encounters, no attempts to speak to me during the day. It was as if I'd become invisible to them. Although I felt a wave of relief at first, the abrupt shift left me unsettled, as if the silence held its own hidden menace. At work, Alex moved through the office quietly, keeping to themselves, their gaze cold and distant whenever they passed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were holding on to a simmering anger, the kind that might not stay dormant for long. I went through my days cautiously, relieved that they had backed off, but wary of the tension that lingered in the air. Despite their silence, the discomfort hadn't vanished completely. The memory of their last angry look stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly their demeanor had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over, that beneath the surface something still lurked, waiting. Though Alex kept their distance, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting them to reappear. Each time I walked into a familiar place, I glanced around, half expecting to see them watching from a corner or lingering nearby. The relief I'd felt from their silence was slowly overshadowed by a nagging paranoia, a sense that the boundaries I'd set might not be respected after all. I became vigilant, avoiding my usual spots and sticking to crowded places, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Every text notification, every unfamiliar face in public made me tense. I felt like I was carrying the memory of Alex's anger with me, an invisible weight that wouldn't let me fully relax. It was as though their presence had seeped into my daily life, haunting my routines and casting shadows over my thoughts. No matter how much I tried to move on, a small part of me stayed on edge, wary of what Alex might do next. I couldn't decide if it was irrational fear or a gut instinct warning me of something more. It was well past midnight, the quiet settling thick around the house. I had been drifting in and out of sleep, enjoying the stillness, when I was jolted awake by a sharp knock at the door. My heart raced as I lay there trying to make sense of the sound. I glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? I got up, moving carefully through the darkened house, my senses on high alert. I switched on the porch light and peered through the peephole, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the porch was empty, the night outside calm and undisturbed. A chill ran through me, but I told myself it was just a prank, maybe a teenager messing around. I went back to bed, willing myself to fall asleep, though a slight unease lingered. The next night, just as I was beginning to relax, it happened again. I had barely drifted off to sleep when I heard it, the same sharp knock, clear and unmistakable. This time it was louder, more insistent, echoing through the silent house. I sat up, feeling a familiar sense of dread building in my chest. I glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Again, I made my way to the door, switching on the porch light and peering out into the night. But once again, there was no one there, no sign of anyone around. The street was still and empty, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But as I closed the door, a cold dread settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence, that someone was deliberately playing games. The next few nights followed the same pattern. Every night, without fail, the knocking returned at precisely 2:13 a.m., each time louder and more deliberate. I began to lose sleep, the nightly disturbance becoming a source of constant anxiety. I'd lay awake, waiting for the knock, feeling a creeping sense of dread as the clock ticked closer to that cursed hour. One night, desperate to catch whoever was behind it, I decided to wait by the door, keeping the lights off, listening carefully for any sound. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel my heart racing, my entire body tense with anticipation. And then, just as expected, the knock came, sharp and jarring. But this time I caught something else, a faint movement outside the window. My breath caught in my throat as I peered through the curtains, just in time to catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving past the window, circling the house. I couldn't make out any features. It was just a dark, indistinct shape, but the sight sent a chill through me. The figure paused for a moment, almost as if sensing my gaze, before slipping out of sight, disappearing into the night. My hands shook as I pulled the curtains shut, my mind racing with questions and a growing sense of fear. Whoever, or whatever, was outside my house had no intention of leaving me in peace. The knocking didn't just continue, it grew worse. Each night, the sound became louder, more urgent, echoing through the house with a force that rattled the door. It felt like a demand, as if whoever was out there was trying to break through, to force their way inside. I couldn't ignore it any longer, the fear now all-consuming. I started dreading the nights, the hours spent lying awake, my heart racing as I waited for that inevitable knock. By now, I didn't dare check the door, too terrified to confront whatever might be lurking outside. Instead, I lay in bed, blankets pulled tight around me, each knock reverberating through my mind, filling me with a dread that made sleep impossible. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. I felt trapped, unable to escape, with no explanation for what was happening or why it was happening to me. Every sound in the house became sinister, every shadow filled with unseen threats. It was as though my home had turned against me, each night bringing a new wave of fear that eroded my sense of safety. I knew something had to be done. I couldn't keep living like this. After another sleepless night of relentless knocking and the disturbing presence of the shadowy figure, I reached my breaking point. The fear had seeped into every corner of my life. I could no longer ignore the terror that had become my nightly ritual. Exhausted and desperate, I finally called the police, hoping they'd bring some sense of security or a logical explanation. 2 officers arrived promptly, their calm, professional demeanor a temporary balm to my frayed nerves. I described the disturbances, the nightly knocks at precisely 2:13 a.m., and the shadowy figure I'd seen lurking around the house. They took notes, assured me they'd checked the perimeter thoroughly, and advised me to stay inside while they investigated. I watched as they circled the house, flashlights cutting through the darkness, inspecting every corner and shrub. After what felt like an eternity, they returned with a grim shake of their heads. "We didn't find anything unusual," one of the officers said. "No footprints, no signs of forced entry, and no evidence of anyone trying to approach the house." They suggested it might be an elaborate prank or possibly just my imagination playing tricks due to the lack of physical evidence. Their response left me frustrated and defeated. I could tell they thought I was overreacting, but I knew what I'd seen and heard. I thanked them, trying to mask my disappointment, but as they left, a new wave of fear washed over me. I was alone again, left with nothing but their empty reassurances and the knowledge that my tormentor would be back. That night, I braced myself for what was now inevitable: the knocking, the haunting figure outside, the feeling of being watched. I went to bed early, hoping to get at least a few hours of rest before the dreaded hour arrived. But as 2:13 a.m. crept closer, my anxiety grew, my mind racing with questions and dread. I lay motionless, my body tense, waiting for the first knock. And then it came, louder than ever, a sharp, insistent pounding that shook the entire doorframe. I could feel the vibrations echoing through the house, each knock more forceful, more desperate than the last. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay there, frozen, unable to move or even breathe. Out of sheer instinct, I turned my head toward the window, hoping that maybe, somehow, I could glimpse what was tormenting me. There, just beyond the glass, the figure was back, drifting around the house, moving closer to the door with each slow pass. The shadow seemed darker, more defined than before, and I felt its presence press against the walls, as if it were testing the boundaries, searching for a way in. Panic surged through me, and I realized, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was outside wasn't just going to stop. It wasn't going to leave on its own. It wanted something I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. I knew then that this wasn't my home anymore. It was a place I could no longer stay. As dawn broke, I made my decision. I couldn't live like this, in a house where fear and dread had taken root. The sleepless nights, the pounding knocks, the lurking figure outside. Every piece of this nightmare had drained me, leaving me with no choice but to leave it all behind. I needed to reclaim my peace, my safety, somewhere far from the haunting presence that had turned my home into a place of terror. I began packing my things, throwing clothes, books, and personal belongings into bags as quickly as I could, unwilling to spend another night under this roof. Each room felt tainted, every shadow a reminder of what I'd experienced. I glanced nervously out the windows as I packed, half expecting to see that figure watching, waiting, knowing I was preparing to leave. By the time I finished packing, the sense of urgency had grown overwhelming, and I barely took a moment to look back. With a final glance, I left the house, locking the door behind me and feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. I didn't know if leaving would truly free me, but anything was better than spending another night in a place where fear had become a permanent resident. I came home that evening expecting to be greeted by the familiar sounds of paws rushing to meet me. But the house was eerily quiet, a silence that struck me as odd and unsettling. I called out, expecting my pet to bound into view, but there was no response. I checked every room, thinking perhaps they were hiding or sleeping somewhere I hadn't thought to look. But as each room turned up empty, a growing pit of dread formed in my stomach. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, my voice louder this time as I called out, but there was no sign of them. I asked neighbors if they'd seen my pet wandering around, but no one had seen anything. Each second that passed without a sighting or a familiar sound heightened my anxiety. I began scouring the neighborhood, hoping that they'd simply wandered off and would come bounding back as soon as I found them. But as the hours stretched on, my hope began to fade. By the end of the night, I was exhausted, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with worry, I found a note waiting for me on my front doorstep. It was a single slip of paper with no envelope or explanation. The message, written in an odd, slanted script, sent a chill down my spine. Your pet is safe for now. There was no name, no contact information, just a single ominous line followed by a strange mark, almost like a symbol, drawn hastily as though by a shaky hand. I stood there, rereading the note, trying to make sense of it. My immediate thought was that it had to be a prank, some cruel joke by someone with a twisted sense of humor. But deep down, I felt an icy dread settle in, the kind that made it hard to think straight. Whoever had left that note was watching, aware of my pet's absence, and if they were telling the truth, they had taken my pet. The thought sent a shudder through me. Over the course of the day, I tried to push the note out of my mind, telling myself that it had to be a coincidence. But the words kept replaying in my head, each repetition more unsettling than the last. Every time I glanced at the door, I half expected another message to appear, a reminder that I wasn't the only one invested in my pet's whereabouts. Days went by with no further signs or messages, but my unease only grew. I spent hours retracing my steps, revisiting places my pet might have gone, checking with neighbors again, and even putting up missing pet posters around town. With each passing day, the lack of leads chipped away at my hope, and I started to feel the weight of helplessness settling over me. I couldn't shake the thought that someone was holding my pet, deliberately keeping them from me. Then, just as I was beginning to think the note had been a one-time message, a second one appeared. This time, it was taped to my car windshield, the same slanted script and cryptic tone. Stop searching. They are safe, but only if you listen. The note didn't clarify what it meant, only hinted at some vague set of instructions, a demand that I stop searching if I wanted my pet back. I stared at the message, feeling a wave of frustration and fear. Who would do this, and why? The lack of details, the taunting nature of the messages, all of it made me feel as though I was in a game I couldn't win. But giving up the search felt impossible. The thought of stopping and simply waiting for more messages was unbearable. Yet the idea that my continued efforts might put my pet in more danger gnawed at me. I was stuck, caught between action and inaction, uncertain which would bring my pet back. Days later, another note appeared, this time shoved through my mailbox. I didn't even need to look at it to know what it was. The familiar handwriting in that same symbol told me everything I needed to know. This message was different, though. The words were sharper, more sinister. You're putting them at risk. Stop now if you want them back. My hands trembled as I read it, the threat unmistakable. This was no joke, no prank. Someone was holding my pet, and they were willing to harm them if I didn't comply. The fear I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced before. A raw, paralyzing terror that made my stomach twist and my thoughts blur. I couldn't ignore the message any longer. My attempts to find my pet, the posters, the questions to neighbors, none of it had brought me any closer to them. Instead, it seemed like my efforts had only angered the person responsible. I began to wonder if they were closer than I'd thought, maybe even someone from the neighborhood, someone who had been watching me all along. That night, I made the difficult decision to stop searching, at least for the time being. The guilt was overwhelming, but the fear of what might happen if I continued drove me to comply. All I could do was hope that by obeying their demands, I might get one step closer to bringing my pet home safely. The silence that followed my decision was unnerving. I went about my days, waiting, hoping that I'd done enough to prove my compliance. But each moment felt like an eternity. I checked my mailbox obsessively, scanned my doorstep each morning, expecting the next note. The longer I waited, the more desperate I became, my mind filling with dark thoughts about what might be happening to my pet. Then one evening, I found it, the note I'd been waiting for. Taped to my front door was a message with a single haunting line: "Meet me tomorrow at 7 p.m. by the old playground." The location was odd. It was a rundown playground just outside town, a place rarely visited anymore. The choice of location made my skin crawl, but the words at the bottom gave me no choice. "Come alone if you want to see them again." I spent that night in anxious anticipation, barely able to sleep. Every hour, my mind ran through different scenarios, each one more ominous than the last. The silence of my home felt suffocating, reminding me of the absence of my pet and the void that had filled my life since their disappearance. I knew this meeting might be my only chance to get them back, and I was prepared to do whatever it took. The next day, I arrived early at the playground, my heart pounding as I surveyed the empty area. The rusted swings creaked softly in the breeze, and shadows stretched across the cracked pavement, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I waited, my eyes scanning every corner, hoping to see my pet or the person responsible. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that no one was coming. A wave of frustration and despair hit me. I had done everything asked, complied with each demand, and yet I was still empty-handed. The anger surged, and I realized I couldn't handle this alone anymore. I needed help. Desperation won out over fear, and I decided to go to the police. At the station, I recounted every detail, handing over the notes and describing the ordeal in full. The officer listened carefully, taking my story seriously, which brought me a small sense of relief. They assured me they would investigate, and knowing I wasn't alone in this gave me hope for the first time in days. Although I worried about the consequences of involving the authorities, I felt I had exhausted every other option. Once the police began investigating, things progressed quickly. They started tracing the locations where I'd found the notes, looking for any clues or patterns that might point to the person responsible. Days passed in a blur as I waited, alternating between hope and dread. The police kept me updated, telling me they had found evidence of tampering near my property. A few fingerprints, a footprint, even a torn piece of cloth that didn't belong to me. Then, a breakthrough. One of the officers called to tell me they'd discovered an old shed near the playground that had signs of recent use. Inside, they found scraps of paper matching the ones used for the notes, along with faint traces of animal fur. My heart raced at the thought that my pet had been there, so close, and yet so hidden. The police continued their investigation, piecing together the clues. Each update filled me with cautious optimism. I was closer to getting my pet back than I'd been since the ordeal began. I held on to that hope, waiting for the call that would tell me my pet was finally safe. That call came one morning, just after sunrise. An officer informed me that they had found my pet, safe but shaken, hidden in a remote cabin on the outskirts of town. I was overwhelmed with relief, unable to believe the nightmare was finally ending. They arranged for me to meet my pet at the station, and I drove there, barely able to contain my anticipation. When I walked into the room and saw them, a wave of emotion crashed over me. My pet looked up, recognizing me instantly, and ran to my arms, filling the emptiness that had haunted me for days. It started on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary that the memory of it now feels surreal. I'd come home after a long day, mentally running through my evening routine, when I realized my watch was missing. It was odd. I always left it in the same place, right by the entryway. I checked the table, patted down my pockets, even scanned the nearby surfaces, but it was nowhere to be found. Hours later, after tearing the house apart in search of it, I gave up and decided to let it go, assuming I'd find it eventually. But that night, as I went to bed, I felt a small, niggling unease. It wasn't like me to misplace something so habitual, something I used every day. The next morning, as I headed out, I found the watch in a strange place, lying in the middle of the living room floor. I picked it up, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Turning it over in my hand, I noticed scratches on the back, tiny, deliberate marks that hadn't been there before. I dismissed it, chalking it up to an accident, but the oddness lingered, a faint disturbance in the back of my mind as I went about my day. I tried not to dwell on the watch, brushing it off as an isolated incident. But then, just a few days later, it happened again. This time, it was a keychain, a small trinket with sentimental value that I kept on my desk. I'd seen it just the day before, so when it wasn't there, I knew something was wrong. I searched around, feeling a pang of frustration and a creeping sense of discomfort as I came up empty-handed. Later that evening, I found it on the kitchen counter, a place I was certain I hadn't left it. And like the watch, it had new marks. The once smooth surface was now marred by tiny scratches, almost like someone had purposefully etched lines into it. Holding it in my hand, I felt an inexplicable chill. These weren't random scratches or dents. They felt deliberate, like some kind of message I couldn't interpret. I tried to reason with myself, convincing myself that I was simply misplacing things. But the pattern was clear, and I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was very wrong. After the second incident, I found myself on edge, double-checking everything, making sure I knew where each item was before leaving the room. I began locking up carefully, securing every door and window before bed, trying to reassure myself that I was alone. But it didn't help. The sense of being watched was constant, the feeling that something unseen was tampering with my belongings, lurking just out of sight. I couldn't relax. Even small sounds, like the creak of a floorboard or a tap of a branch against the window, set my nerves on edge. Each night felt like a test of endurance, lying awake, straining to hear any movement. My home, once a place of comfort, had become a place of dread, each room filled with the tension of something hidden and unacknowledged. As I went through my day, I tried to shake off the feeling, but every small noise or misplaced item added to my unease. I was constantly on guard, the ordinary moments of my life tinged with paranoia. But I told myself that vigilance would be enough, that if I was careful, I'd find some logical explanation. Then, one evening, something deeply personal disappeared. My mother's ring, an heirloom I kept in a small box on my nightstand. When I reached for it, the box was empty. I felt my stomach drop, an icy wave of dread washing over me. I knew I hadn't touched it, hadn't moved it. I searched every corner of my room, my heart pounding as the sense of invasion grew sharper, more menacing. Hours later, as I entered the living room to make one last desperate attempt to find it, there it was, lying in the middle of the coffee table. I picked it up, and my fingers trembled as I noticed the now familiar markings. Tiny scratches, crude and jagged, covered the ring's once pristine surface. It felt like a violation, as though someone had touched something that held my deepest memories, tarnishing it with deliberate malice. My fear reached its peak. I no longer felt safe in my own home. I felt watched, targeted. The pattern was clear, the message unmistakable. Someone, or something, was tampering with my life, making itself known through the items I held most dear. I knew then that staying here was no longer an option. Whatever this was, I couldn't face it alone. Not anymore. My mind raced as I considered what to do, each thought filled with the overwhelming need to leave and escape the presence that had invaded my home. After the incident with my mother's ring, I knew I couldn't stay. The sense of invasion and malice in those marks was undeniable, and the thought of another cherished object being tampered with left me feeling sick. I decided to move out as soon as possible, not caring about the inconvenience or cost. I just needed to be free of the presence that had taken hold in my home. Packing was a frantic process. I moved quickly, throwing essentials into boxes and bags, refusing to linger on anything sentimental. Yet, with each item I touched, I found myself inspecting it, terrified of finding more marks, more evidence of the intruder. The paranoia was overwhelming. Every glance around the house felt like a confirmation that something was there, watching, waiting for the next chance to invade my life. As I packed, I noticed that several other small items bore similar scratches, tiny, deliberate markings that sent shivers down my spine. Realizing the scope of it made me feel as though I'd been a stranger in my own home for longer than I'd imagined, the hidden presence touching everything I valued. My heart raced as I packed faster, unwilling to spend another moment in the place that had become a trap. The night before I planned to leave was torturous. The house felt colder, more oppressive, every shadow stretching out as though it was filled with eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, the tension so thick that each sound sent my heart racing. I huddled in bed, every nerve on edge, feeling exposed despite the locked doors and windows. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, a noise jolted me awake, a faint, slow creak coming from the living room. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was the same sound I'd heard the night before. I stayed still, barely breathing, as the noise grew louder, each creak reverberating through the silence. Finally, unable to endure it any longer, I crept out of bed to investigate. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved down the hall, every instinct telling me to turn back. When I reached the living room, I froze. There on the coffee table was one last item, a photograph of me and my family, freshly marked with scratches running across each face. It felt like a final message, a sinister reminder of what I was leaving behind. I turned and fled back to my room, barely able to control my breathing. I knew then that this was my last night here, no matter the time. I was leaving, even if it meant abandoning what little remained of my belongings. At first light, I gathered my things and left without a second thought. Every step out of the house felt like a release, a weight lifting off my shoulders with each pace toward my car. I refused to look back, keeping my eyes forward, my mind set on the relief of distance. As I drove away, an eerie sense of silence filled the car. The absence of the strange sounds, the absence of the unexplainable occurrences, felt surreal, as though I'd left an entire world behind. Yet as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt a chill, an irrational sense that the house was still watching, its gaze following me as I put more distance between us. When I reached the outskirts of town, I felt an odd mix of relief and apprehension. Part of me feared that the strange presence would follow, but as the miles ticked by, that fear began to fade. I was leaving that haunted place behind, hoping I'd find peace somewhere new.